that time of year again, guys. It is self-destructing books season, but before we can find out what is going to be on my list of self-destructing books for 2025, we have to look back at 2024 and find out which of those 10 books are now going to be self-destructing. So if you guys are unfamiliar with the concept of self-destructing books, this is a thing that I created on YouTube. I think it was I don't even know how long ago it was now. I think it was pretty early into my channel. But essentially, when it comes to unhauling books, since then, I've made leaps and bounds. I have other stuff on my channel that helps me clear through books that I own and unhaul them, like Shelve It or Scrap It. But back then, and still now really, I have the mentality of not quite wanting to let go of things without giving them a chance. There are tons of things that I own that I don't necessarily think I'm going to enjoy, but there are so many times in the past that I've thought that I'm not going to enjoy something and I've ended up loving it. So I don't want to unhaul those books without giving them a chance. So what self-destructing books is it is a stack of 10 books that I have set aside for a 12-month period, and if we get to the end of the 12 months and I have not read them, I've not attempted to read them, then I have to unhaul them. So this makes things a little bit of a priority for me to dip into, but then it also allows me mentally to come to terms with the fact that these books are potentially going to be leaving my library. So in the past, I have not had a really great track record with self-destructing books. I don't tend to read very many of them. I put them in a pile, I kind of forget about them. And the way I feel that my brain works is actually just the act of putting them to one side and saying like, I am going to be parting with you in 12 months is enough to help me break down those ties that I feel to these books. And so by the time we get to the end of the 12-month period, like I don't really feel bad at all that I'm going to be unhauling them. However, this year is a little bit different because I have read or attempted to read all of my 2024 self-destructing books. And so because of that, we are going to be conducting this video a little bit differently. Usually I react to the video that I made 1 year ago because I've normally forgotten about a lot of the books that I set aside to self-destruct. But this year I've read them all or attempted to read them all, so I didn't really see the point in reacting to a video when nothing's going to be a surprise. Like I've read the books, like I know what they are. So we are just going to be covering the 10 books that I set aside to self-destruct in 2024. If you guys would like to see my full thoughts and opinions on these books though, I did actually read them in 2 separate episodes of Shelve It or Scrap It. In episode 8 of Shelve It or Scrap It last year, and more recently episode 13 where I finished off the stack. Every year I try and do a little bit of a theme for these self-destructing books, and last year my theme was sequels. So this made it a little bit more high stakes. It made me really want to prioritize the books a little bit more. They were the kind of series where I'd read the first book, maybe given it 3 stars, seen potential, but wasn't really too invested in continuing. So I definitely wanted to give the rest of the series a try because there were elements of the earlier book or books that I'd liked, but I didn't feel like it was something that was maybe worth continuing to invest my time into. But before we move on, I just wanted to ask, are you enjoying this content that you are currently watching? If you are, maybe you have thought about creating content yourself, but you don't really know where to start. And that is where I think the sponsor of today's video could really come in handy, which is Skillshare. Skillshare are an online learning community for creatives that provide thousands of on-demand classes that can really help you to level up your skills, whether that be in your professional life or your personal life. The topics that Skillshare covers range from photography, art, business management, baking, and pretty much everything in between. Now that spring has sprung, maybe you are looking for a new project or a new hobby that you would like to pick up in 2025, and just maybe that project is content creation. One of my favorite creators on Skillshare is Ali Abdaal, who is most commonly known, I feel, for his productivity classes, quite a few of which I've actually taken in the past, but he does also have quite a lot of content creation classes, including one on how to start and grow a YouTube channel. One of my favorite things about Skillshare is that they not only cater to absolute beginners, but people who have a little bit of experience in an industry that are maybe wanting to expand upon their skills. So at this point, I have been a content creator for almost 8 years, but there is still so much that I have to learn across the vast topic of content creation. If you guys guys follow me on Instagram, you may have noticed that recently I've been posting quite a few reels, and perhaps surprisingly, that is very different to creating long form content for YouTube. And Skillshare has tons of classes relating to short form content that are giving me little tips and tricks that I can put into play to help me to branch out into this new different area of content creation that I am unfamiliar with. So if starting a new project sounds like something you could be interested in right now, I'm happy to let you guys know that the first 500 people who click on the link at the top of my description box will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare to kickstart that hobby. And a big thank you, of course, to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. So the first 4 books that I read from my 2024 self-destructing pile, I unhauled. I do not have them. I have the last 6 that I read, but the first 4 I said goodbye to, so that gives you a good indication of my thoughts and feelings on them. But the first one is Misrule by Heather Walter. This was the second book in the Malice duology, which was a dark Sleeping Beauty retelling from the perspective of the Maleficent character who is called Alice. So in this world you have graces who bestow gifts of beauty and health upon people, and you also have Alice who is the dark grace who curses people. This is something that is sought after amongst the nobility of this world, but they all look down upon Alice for it, even while they are utilizing her services. So she's pretty much excluded from everything, but one day she's actually invited to Aurora's birthday party where she meets Princess Aurora, and slowly but surely those two develop a friendship which blossoms into a romance. This is a new adult duology, and my main criticism of the first book was that I wanted it to go a little bit darker for a villain origin story. I did really love the world building though, and that is why I wanted to continue. I just wanted to see it go a little bit darker when it's supposed to be a dark story, and the way that the first book left off gave me some indication that it may go in that direction. However, I was very disappointed by Misrule. I felt that it completely missed the mark. It was almost a completely different story, and it spent so much time setting up this new scenario that the main character was in, with a whole new range of side characters and a very different setting. Not geographically it was the same setting, but politically, and the way that this society now operated was very different to in book 1, and I felt like it spent so much time setting up all of this stuff that it felt completely different, and I just really didn't care. And it also still did not go to that level of darkness. Guys, a tip: if you're an author and you're writing a villain origin story, make it a villain origin story. Make them a villain. That is why we're reading it. And so yeah, I was sorely disappointed by this one, and I unhauled. The second book was Ruthless Gods by Emily A. Duncan, and this is one that I very, very quickly DNF'd. So I read Wicked Saints way back when, and it was okay. I felt like that was a book that had a lot of potential that it just didn't quite achieve. Once again, it was supposed to be a dark story. The characters were doing questionable things, I guess, but I didn't believe them. I honestly can't even tell you what that book was about right now, but it has since become the topic of a lot of controversy because the author Emily A. Duncan was bullying a bunch of other debut authors at that time, which all came to light around the release of the third book. I had all of the books at this point when this came to light, and so I was like, okay, I'll just try them, and if I don't like them, I'll just unhaul them, it's whatever. Some series, some that we'll talk about later in this video, do a really good job of picking up the thread of book 1 to keep the reader grounded when it's been a period of time since they read the earlier books in the series. This is not one of those series, and I was very quickly lost within the first 30 pages of this book, and truly I did not care enough about this series to bother trying to reestablish myself, and so I just DNF'd it. It's not an author that I wanted to support anyway. I was really just trying this book to satisfy an urge because I felt like I had to, and I very quickly realized that I just wasn't all that invested. I also tried The Solace of Sharp Claws by Lana Pacherzik. This is the second book in the Fae Guardian series, specifically the Season of the Wolf. So this is a long series it's not a paranormal romance, but the formula and structure of the series is very similar to paranormal romance to me, and it's broken down into I don't know how many, there's at least 3 different series within this. There's the Season of the Wolf, there's, I don't know if it's called the Season of the Vampire, but the next set of books follow vampires, and the next ones follow elves, and I don't know if it like goes past that. But this was the second book in the Season of the Wolf, which is the first part of the Fae Guardian series, and I didn't love the first book. I enjoyed the concept of this world because this is not a paranormal romance. It is either a dystopian or more of a fantasy romance, but it is set in a futuristic version of our world where the world has ended and the magic in this world is being blocked by metals and plastics. So when you strip those back, like the world has ended and nature has reclaimed the land again, the magic has come back to the land, and with that we have the resurgence of Fae. So the love interests in this series are all Fae Guardians, so prominent Fae warriors, and the female main characters are women from our time who have been preserved and frozen for the however many hundreds of thousands of years it's been since the world has ended, and have thawed, and they're all mated to one of these Fae Guardians. So I feel like you can see how it is similar to a paranormal romance. It's also a series where we follow like a different couple per book, and it has a little bit of an overarching plot, but the focus of these books is truly the romance between the main characters as opposed to the plot, and it's the plot and the world that I was interested in. So to satisfy my curiosity, I did read book 2. I'm pretty sure I finished it just to figure out if we were going to get into any more depth or detail on the world, but I don't just feel like, because this is predominantly a romantic series, the background, like the setting and the plot are just there to give the book a structure to follow, and it's definitely not the focus, and it's that I wanted the book to focus on. It's that interested me. I didn't really care about this revolving door of Fae Guardians and frozen women, and so I decided that this just wasn't for me. I mean, based on the writing style and the execution of the book, it just wasn't something that was going to go into the degree of detail that I wanted. Like, I was going into this world from like a high fantasy mentality of wanting to know the exact hows and whys of everything that was going on here, and it's just not the kind of story that this book is. And then the last one that I unhauled is The Night Country by Melissa Albert. This one was a sequel to The Hazelwood, which is a YA contemporary fantasy about a girl who is the granddaughter of an author of this like cult book of fairy tales. There were not many copies printed, and the people who like this book are really obsessive about it, and the main character's mother, and therefore the main character, have been on the run from people who are really into this book of fairy tales for a very long time. Now, the first book, The Hazelwood, is not a book that I should have enjoyed. It is which is why I like to try books, because sometimes something surprises me, but it was very kind of, I don't want to say it had a soft magic system, but it was very much a kind of go with the flow book. And I like we've established, I like to know the hows, the whys, and the whats of what is going on. This starts off as a contemporary fantasy, turns into a little bit of a portal fantasy, but also has the, I guess, etherealness of like a fever dream where nothing quite makes sense and everything's hazy and you're just kind of along for the ride. So something about it being completely different than I anticipated really endeared me to book 1, and so it would have been fine as a standalone, but a second book was published, and so I thought that I would give it a try. And I discovered in the second book that it is really the contemporary elements of Melissa Albert's writing that I like. I really like her writing style and the atmosphere that she builds, but I don't like that kind of fantasy, which is something that we knew, and I really just didn't like the second book. I don't feel like it served much of a purpose. I feel like it didn't do anything, like it was just existed for the sake of it, and it really did not end in a satisfactory way for me. So when I read that one, I also unhauled both of those. And then for the 6 that I read most recently, I'm not going to go in any particular order, but I am going to save a specific one for last. So the first one we're going to be talking about is The Boy on the Bridge by M.R. Carey. This is once again the second book in a duology, but it is actually a prequel story, so I think you can probably read this without having read the first book, which is The Girl with All the Gifts, but you can definitely read The Girl with All the Gifts without continuing on and reading The Boy on the Bridge. So this one is a zombie story that is set in the UK. The Girl with All the Gifts follows a zombie girl who is being kept in this military facility and being experimented on. So the prequel takes it back, I think it did say how many years, I want to say it's like 10 or 20 years before The Girl with All the Gifts, and it is following an expedition that has been sent out to gather experiments that have been left behind by a previous group of scientists scientists. So we have the scientists who are going to collect and analyze the samples, we have the military personnel who are going to protect them, and we have an extremely intelligent boy who has already invented something that is helping humanity survive the zombie virus, who has gone along on this mission to see if he can glean anything from the samples the scientists are gathering that potentially they have missed. So I do like M.R. Carey's books, and I like them because of the nitty-gritty of the virus. However, the way that these stories are told is that they are following like a variety of characters that you're not really supposed to care about. I feel it's more about what the characters are doing than the characters themselves. But I would say that this book and this series is character driven to a degree, but a lot of them are not likable people, and because of that I don't care to read from their perspectives a lot, and it goes into the nitty gritty of their lives because it has like such a slow build to a really good climax. Like I'll definitely give Emma Carey that. The way that everything kind of slowly comes together into this big thing that blows up, I really enjoyed. And I also really enjoy the scientific element, the version of zombies and the evolution of zombies in M.R. Carey's version of a zombie apocalypse, but it has more of a literary skew to the storytelling that doesn't particularly interest me. And so while I have enjoyed both of these books, I don't have any need to keep them. I DNF'd Blood and Honey by Shelby Mahurin. I gave Serpent and Dove 5 stars as well, but I did, like, as soon as I finished that book, I gave it a few weeks and I was like, you know what, that is not a 5 star, it's more of a 3. I was really just swept away in the moment of Serpent and Dove. This is also at a time where fantasy romance wasn't super popular, so having anything that was like quite romance focused in a fantasy world was really exciting for me. Now, however, I do feel differently. Like, there's fantasy romance everywhere right now, but in this one we are following a witch and a witch hunter who are forced into a marriage by, I don't know if he's the Pope or like an archbishop, but he's like a religious leader in this world. It's set in medieval France, and the witch and the witch hunter end up in a compromising position when he is trying to capture her because she's a thief. And because they're in this compromising position, they're forced into this marriage where the witch hunter does not know that the main character is a witch, although they do dislike each other. And despite everything, they kind of grow closer, and the love interest has to like challenge his prejudice and open his eyes to the world around him. Now, before I started Blood and Honey, I did read a pretty decent recap of Serpent and Dove, and I was shook by how little happened in that book. It is definitely like the Emily A. Duncan series. It is a series that is not going to really help you with the events of book one. Like, you kind of have to either read them back to back or rely on a good recap. And I didn't truly, I knew I'd forgotten a lot, but there wasn't much to forget that happened in Serpent and Dove. So I got, I think, about 200 pages into this one, and it was fine. Like, I could have continued reading it, but I realized that I just really didn't care about anything that was happening. Like, the boat had left on this series for me, and I was reading it for the sake of it, and I just didn't care, so I DNF'd. One that I was really sad about is Cytonic by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 3rd book in the Skyward series, and I love Brandon Sanderson, okay? He is one of my favorite authors. I adore the Cosmere. However, I don't really gel with Brandon Sanderson's young adult work, but the really sad thing about this is how I loved book 1, and it just declined throughout the series for me. So this is a young adult sci-fi series following a girl called Spencer who lives on a human planet that is perpetually at war with an alien race. So the main focus of this planet is just to consistently raise the next generation of fighter pilots to defend this planet from the constant alien onslaught. The main character, Spencer, wants nothing more than to complete this duty for her planet. However, her father is a deserter, which is the worst possible crime, and so herself and her mother have been treated horribly since her father deserted, and every single person is put in a roadblock in Spencer's way when she is trying to join this flight academy and do her duty for her planet. So the thing that I really loved about book 1 is that we start with quite an unlikable character who is fighting against, like, everybody's in her way and everybody is against her, and she's consistently fighting against this, and then throughout the process of book 1 she becomes a better person. After having done all of that character work with Spencer and following her from being insufferable to being a character that I really loved, it really frustrated me to go in book 2 and once again have Spencer starting off on the back foot, where she has to like really fight against everybody and do a lot of character work along the way. And I feel like she went like two steps backwards in the fact that she was once again this insufferable character that had to become likable once again through another book. And so I was really disheartened and didn't really want to continue the series after that. And once again, kind of like with Blood and Honey, I did read a novella because there's like 2 novellas that go in between book 2 and 3. I'd already read one, so I read the second novella and I just didn't care. I don't like novellas to start off with, and I'm a little bit like too far gone in this series at this point, but I didn't want to DNF the series based on a novella, so I also read quite a bit of this, maybe 100. Oh, my bookmark's still in. I read 129 pages, and while there are elements of this that I really enjoy, I just didn't care enough to want to continue. And I also don't really like the way that Brandon Sanderson writes YA. I feel like he dumbs down his writing a little bit and he makes things like a little bit funny, a little bit silly, and a little bit unserious. The stakes are still high, but the approach to it is a little bit more goofy, and I just don't really enjoy that tone. Another zombie series that I have now DNF'd, I did also DNF this book, is Deadline by Mira Grant. This is book 2 in the Newsflesh series, which I'm coming to realize that I don't love zombie stories because the focus of them tends to never be the thing that I want them to focus on. But this one is set, I think, about 15-20 years into the zombie apocalypse, and when everything went down, when the virus started, the mainstream news really let down the public. Like, they were kind of working on behalf of the government, telling everyone to stay calm, nothing was happening, which resulted in a great loss of life. So everybody turned to bloggers to give them the real truth of what was going on when the world was collapsing. And because of that, bloggers are a little bit more respected in terms of being credible news outlets than they used to be. And we are following siblings in this series who run this blogging company, I guess, and they are chosen by this left-wing president to be the official like news reporters of this presidential campaign. And when they go and they start to follow this campaign, they realize that there is a government conspiracy, that maybe there's somebody trying to assassinate this president, that they're covering things up, and they are digging to get to the bottom of what is going on, while obviously the stakes are getting higher and they're also fighting for their lives. And then you also have the environmental factor of the zombies. So I don't know if there is a zombie story out there for me. This one in particular, I didn't like that it was so much about politics. I was going to say it feels like a speculative novel. Science fiction is generally speculative by design, but it very much felt like, given these conditions, how would America go on? Like, how would the government persist? How would presidential campaigns be carried out? Like, how would things change in the light of a virus? And that is just something that I'm truly not interested in. The tone of this series also has a little bit of a noir spin, which I don't really like. Like, it's not a genre for me. And so that just put me off. I thought that the characters were very unlikable. Somebody, with a warning, left a spoiler in the comments of one of my videos recently. So they did say, like, if you want to be spoiled, like, scroll down. And I'm glad that I did not finish this series. I'm so glad, because what the fuck? A fantasy romance series that was actually one of the first ones that I ever tried was the Tyrant Soul series by C.L. Wilson. This is sadly another book that I DNF'd recently, and it is book 3 in the series Lady of Light and Shadows. So I started this series in 2020 and I read the first 2 books pretty rapidly back to back. And I also picked up book 3 and started that, but I put it down about 150 pages into it because I was moving on to participate in a readathon, and I was like, okay, when the readathon's done, I'll come back to it, and I just never did. Back in the day, it's like with Serpent and Dove, there wasn't a whole ton of fantasy romance around. There was in the indie spaces, but you had to really dig for it. People weren't reading indie stuff like they do now, so there wasn't a ton of recommendations around, and this was one that was highly recommended for people who wanted to read romantic fantasy. My issue with this series is that it is a little bit traditional in terms of the gender roles within the relationship, and that is what put me off. Like, I don't read historical romance, but it felt very much like a historical romance in a fantasy world. You know how some fantasy reads like historical fiction, but like with dragons, like, I don't know, I guess like Game of Thrones? This felt like historical romance, but with fantasy. But in this one, we are following a Fae king who has yet to find his mate, and his people are dying. So he asks his crystal ball, like, how can I save my people? And it shows him this human woman called Elisetta Barastani. So I will never forget this woman's name. And he goes to the human lands to find her, and it ends up kind of reigniting this ancient war between the Fae and the magic wielders of the world, with this human girl being in the center of it. I did feel like if I had to put this series in a world that already exists to give you guys an idea of what the landscape, what this reminds me of, it reminds me a lot of like the Hercules and Xena Warrior Princess TV shows, like a little bit campy, a little bit old-fashioned. Stylistically, if you like that kind of thing, I think you will have a really good time with this series. But something that I just really didn't enjoy is that we very much fell into the classic gender roles of like big strong man protector and like mild gentle female healer, and the fact that they were kind of so solidly within those roles and were kind of performing within those roles didn't really do it for me. And at this point, like, there is a fantasy plot here for sure, but I just wasn't gelling with the romance, and honestly, the guy gives me the ick a little bit, so it was difficult for me to want to continue this one. And then finally, the last self-destructing book, the only one that is not going to self-destruct, is The Memory of Souls by Jen Lyons. And I preface this with saying I should not enjoy this series, but I cannot for the life of me stop reading it. So this one is a high adult epic fantasy series. Predominantly, at least in book one, we're following this boy called Kieran who is prophesied to either make or break the world, and we don't know which way he's gonna go, and he has no idea himself. He doesn't have a clue what's going on. But we start book one where he is in a prison in the present day timeline, and he's trapped in there with a monster, and the monster asks him to tell her a story. So he's like, fine, I'll tell you a story, and he starts telling the story of his life from the place where he perceives his life to have become interesting. So after one chapter of this, the monster stops him and she's like, no, this is not the place where your story began. And she takes it further back in time and starts his story from an earlier perspective. So stylistically, this series is interesting. In the first two books, it follows the same format of switching between perspectives in first person when Kieran's telling his story, and third person where his story is being told to him by somebody else, up until you get towards the end of the book and it catches up to the timelines catch up to each other, which catch up to the present timeline, and the story continues. It is a very confusing, convoluted series. You have 8 gods, 8 god kings, 8 dragons. Some of them are the same, like some of them are reincarnated versions of each other. All of the main cast of characters are reincarnated from something else, also all related to each other, but it's not incest, and we will clarify 100 times throughout these books how exactly it isn't incest, because even though they're technically related, they swapped bodies, so genetically, like, they're not related, and it's all just super convoluted and complex for the sake of being complex. That being said, I enjoyed book one. I gave it 4 stars. I probably would give it 3 if I read it now, because I'm a little bit more critical with my ratings, but I enjoyed it. And then book 2 just repeated the same formula with a new character. I didn't like this second character as much. I didn't like the setting as much, while the social structure of the world was very interesting. And that really, really put me off continuing because of the size of these books as well. And sometimes, like, with how tedious I find how convoluted they are, I just really didn't want to continue, which is why I put this book onto my list of self-destructing books. However, I really feel like I benefited from taking like 3 years away from the series and jumping back into book 3, because now, while I can tell you why I didn't like book 2, I'm not pressed about it. Like, I'm not actually as annoyed as I was at the time that I read it, which meant that I can move on to book 3. If I'd have tried to read this sooner, I probably would have DNF'd it. And I still think that the complexity in here is simply for the sake of being complex. I don't think that it's necessary. There are a lot of elements of this series that are borrowed from Wheel of Time, just like how a lot of the first Law series is borrowed from Game of Thrones, but Joe Abercrombie puts like a funny, silly, goofy tone on it. I feel like Jen Lyons does the same with Wheel of Time. Not that it isn't original, there's a lot about this series that is different, but I feel like it has a lot of components that I really love in adult epic fantasy that has been played with and twisted a little bit, and Jen Lyons really does put like a little humorous spin on a lot of conventions of the genre, which, as somebody, I've said this before, I'm a serious person, I like serious books, and while I understand how satire and playing with conventions of genres has a place in literature, and I don't begrudge it existing, I don't like it when I read it. I could tell you more that I dislike about this series than I like, but I cannot read an 800-page book if I'm not enjoying it, and I read this in 4 days. So there is something about this that I enjoy. I cannot tell you what it is, but I also cannot put this series down. So I kept it. I will continue on with the Chorus of Dragons series, probably begrudgingly. This feels a lot like the Naomi Novik series to me, the Scholomance one, where I loved the story, but I hated the writing. And so I read the entire thing, but I couldn't recommend it as a series I enjoy, but there's just something about it that really kept me captivated. So here are 6 of my 10 self-destructing books for 2024, 9 of which have self-destructed. Only one has lived to see another day. Let me know down in the comments whether you have read any of these, like what your thoughts on them are. I truly don't regret unhauling any of these, and I am actually really glad that I decided to choose sequels as my self-destructing books theme for last year. It did push me to actually have to read them all because I was more invested in them because they were series. I really didn't want to unhaul them without trying them, which resulted in our first like completion of a self-destructing book list in all of the years that I've been doing this, which is really cool. And I'm also glad because I've resolved a bunch of series, like I've DNF'd a bunch that I don't have to continue on with and that I don't have to worry about going forward, which is somebody who is currently in the middle of, I think probably after DNF and all of these, still about 60 to 70 series, potentially even more if I'm being honest. It's good to be able to clear through some of the ones that I'm just no longer interested in pursuing to give me time and space to focus on ones that I am. Will I ever do that though? Stay tuned and find out. I'm not sure. Also, if you're interested, please do stay tuned and find out what will be on my 2025 list of self-destructing books, which should be hitting your subscription feed in the next week. But aside from that, guys, down in the comments, if you don't feel like you have anything to say but you would like to let me know that you were here, leave me a zombie emoji for The Boy on the Bridge and also for Deadline. Once again, a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this one, and of course do not forget, if you are amongst the first 500 people to click on the link at the top of my description box, you will receive a free 1-month trial of Skillshare. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. You head to my description box, you will find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram and my Patreon if you'd like to join me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.